Revenge Office Stories. The CEO laughed while he mocked my farewell speech in front of the whole company. That sound, bouncing off the auditorium walls through the microphone, was just a hollow echo of contempt. He thought he'd won. He thought he was putting me in my place one last time, a final, public show of his power. What he didn't know was that I had a secret. He didn't know my real farewell wasn't the polite little speech I'd just given. My real farewell was a completely different kind of document. This is the story of how a single, well-placed tip to the SEC, born from that one moment of public humiliation, unraveled his corrupt empire and wiped out their stock dreams. It's the story of how the woman he called the Queen of Spreadsheets brought down a king. To understand how it all fell apart, you first have to understand how it was built. And a huge part of how Sterling Innovations was built was me. My name is Elena, and for 8 years I wasn't just an employee. I was basically part of the foundation. I came on board when the company was little more than a charismatic CEO, Richard Sterling, and a rented office that always smelled like new paint and stale coffee. Richard had the vision, that magnetic personality that could charm millions out of venture capitalists and convince brilliant people to work for equity that was basically monopoly money. I was one of those brilliant people. I was a data scientist, though back then the title was a lot less formal. I was the one who took Richard's huge, abstract ideas and found a way to make them real. Our big product, Odyssey, was a predictive analytics platform for the logistics industry. It promised to change supply chains forever by seeing disruptions before they even happened. It was a beautiful idea, but ideas don't write code. Ideas don't build algorithms. I did. I was the lead architect of the Odyssey platform. I designed its core, the complex web of machine learning models and data pipelines that took messy, real-world information and spit out elegant, actionable insights. In the early days, it was thrilling. We were a team, a little band of believers trying to do the impossible. Richard was a mentor then, or at least he played the part well. He'd bring me coffee, sit by my desk, and just watch, mesmerized as I made the data dance. He called me his secret weapon, his oracle. He knew my value back then, when he needed it to build his kingdom. The hours were insane. I poured my entire 20s into that company. I can't count the nights spent fueled by lukewarm pizza and the glow of my monitors, chasing down some tiny bug or optimizing a query to shave milliseconds off its response time. I was the one paged at 3 a.m. when a server failed. I was the one who wrote the technical docs nobody else wanted to touch. My name was on the internal patents, right under the company's, a collection of IP that formed the bedrock of our valuation. The company's success was, in a very real way, my success. I built the engine that drove their billion-dollar car. But as Sterling Innovations got bigger, something shifted. The we, from the early days, slowly became the I of Richard Sterling. The small office turned into a sprawling campus with glass walls and a fancy cafeteria. The company's story, which used to be about collaborative innovation, was carefully rewritten into the myth of a lone genius, Richard Sterling. In interviews and on magazine covers, he talked about his platform, his algorithms, his vision, my role, and the roles of the other founding engineers. Just got airbrushed out of the picture. I wasn't the oracle anymore. I was a resource. My team, once the heart of the company, became just another line item in the R&D budget. The change in Richard was gradual and then all at once. The mentorship soured into condescension. He started explaining my own work back to me in meetings, simplifying it for the non-technical execs in a way that just chipped away at my authority. He'd interrupt me, wave a hand, and go, "Elena, let me handle the big picture stuff. You just keep the engine running." The casual sexism, which wasn't there before, started creeping in. He praised my diligence and attention to detail, words you'd use for a good assistant, not the architect of a multi-million-dollar software platform. He was building a story where he was the visionary and I was just a hardworking, if brilliant, pair of hands. He needed my work, but he couldn't stand the thought that he depended on me. He needed everyone to believe the magic came from him, not from the complex math humming away on servers that I'd built. The decision to leave wasn't one big thing. It was a slow-motion demolition of my professional dignity. Death by 1,000 paper cuts. There was the promotion I was promised, the VP of engineering role. I was the obvious choice. I'd built the department from scratch. I had mentored every senior engineer we had. But the job went to an outside hire, some guy with a flashy resume who talked a good game but couldn't tell a Python script from a coffee script. When I asked Richard why, he gave me this patronizing smile and said the board wanted someone with more traditional management experience. It was a slap in the face, and we both knew it. Then he started stealing my ideas. I developed a concept for a new feature, an expansion of Odyssey into maritime logistics. I spent a month on a proof of concept, putting together a detailed presentation. The day before I was supposed to present it to the exec team, Richard called me into his office. He loved it, he said. He was so excited he wanted to champion it himself to make sure it got the resources it deserved. The next day, I sat in that boardroom and watched Richard present my slides, my data, my roadmap, like he'd pulled it all out of thin air. He never said my name. When a board member asked a technical question he couldn't answer, he just gestured at me and said, "Elena can fill you in on the nitty-gritty later." The nitty-gritty, the very heart of the project. But the real reason I had to get out wasn't about pride or credit. It was about integrity. As the system architect, I had a God's eye view of everything. I could see the raw data, the unfiltered truth, before marketing polished it and finance packaged it for investors. And I started seeing things that made my stomach turn. It started with the user engagement numbers. The metrics Richard was bragging about in our all-hands meetings, the numbers pushing our stock price up, didn't quite match the raw logs I was seeing. There were discrepancies, small at first, but they were growing. I found scripts running at odd hours, creating synthetic users, ghost accounts that would log in, perform a few automated clicks to look like real activity and log out. It was a clear-cut way to inflate our daily active user counts, a key metric for a company like ours. Then I looked at the financials. I'd built the system that fed data to the finance department. I saw that certain big contracts were being counted as revenue the moment they were signed, not when the service was delivered or paid for, which is a major no-no in accounting. It was a trick to pull future earnings into the current quarter, creating this illusion of insane, gravity-defying growth. I did what you're supposed to do. I followed the internal process. I documented everything and scheduled a meeting with my boss, the new VP of engineering. He looked at my report, his face went pale, and he told me he'd take it from here. A week later, he told me to drop it. He said I was mistaken, that I was misinterpreting the data, and that my job was to manage tech, not play amateur accountant. I didn't stop. I escalated, requesting a meeting with Richard and our head of compliance. That meeting was the beginning of the end. Richard didn't even glance at my documents. He leaned back in his big leather chair, the picture of dismissive arrogance, and told me I was being paranoid and overly emotional. He said, "Elena, you are a brilliant technician, truly, but you don't understand the pressures of a public company. We have to maintain confidence. These are just aggressive, standard practices." Then he implied that digging into this stuff could be seen as disloyal. The message was crystal clear. Sit down, shut up, and keep coding. That's when I knew I was done. It wasn't my company anymore. It was a lie, and I was being told to be a silent accomplice. My work, my algorithms designed to find truth in data, were being twisted to manufacture deceit. I went back to my desk and typed out my resignation. I kept it professional, saying I wanted new challenges. I agreed to a standard 2-week notice to make sure things went smoothly. I thought I could just walk away with my head held high. I was so wrong. Richard wasn't going to let me just leave. He had to make an example of me. The day I left was completely surreal. HR scheduled a small farewell thing in the main atrium. My team was there, a few of the old-timers, all looking really uncomfortable. They knew my value. They knew why I was leaving, even if we never said it out loud. I was just going to say a few words, thank my team, and slip out quietly. But Richard had other plans. Just as I was about to speak, he strode up to the front, grabbed the mic, and announced he wanted to give me a proper sterling send-off. The whole company, hundreds of people, was there for the weekly all-hands meeting. My private goodbye had just turned into a public spectacle. He started with what sounded like praise. "We're all here to say goodbye to Elena," he boomed, his voice dripping with fake sincerity. "For 8 years, Elena has been, well, she's been here. She's seen it all." A few nervous laughs rippled through the crowd. I gave my short, polite speech. I thanked my team for their genius and hard work. I said I was proud of what we built together. I wished the company the best. I kept my voice steady. I was determined to leave with grace. Then Richard took the mic back. "Thank you, Elena, for those words," he said, a smirk playing on his lips. "Now, I'd like to say a few things." He looked right at me, but he was performing for everyone else. "Elena mentioned the platform we built," he said, putting this nasty emphasis on we. "And it's true she was instrumental. Every great orchestra needs a first chair, but it also needs people to turn the pages of the sheet music. Elena was fantastic at turning the pages." My blood ran cold. The insult was so precise, so belittling. In one sentence, he'd reduced my role as an architect to a helper. He wasn't finished. "She has the title of Lead Data Architect." Sounds very impressive, doesn't it? He paused for laughter, and this time it was louder, coming from his yes-men in the front rows. I always thought of her as our queen of spreadsheets. Because at the end of the day, that's what all this big data stuff is, right? Just very, very large spreadsheets. The humiliation was a physical thing. I could feel hundreds of pairs of eyes on me. I just stood there, frozen with a fake smile plastered on my face, while the man who built his fortune on my intellect painted me as a glorified clerk. He went on, "She's moving on to new challenges, and we wish her the best. It takes a certain kind of person to build something from scratch. It takes a different kind of person to scale it to a global enterprise. We're grateful for her contributions in the early days, but now that we're in the big leagues, it's time for a different skill set." He clapped me on the shoulder, a final, patronizing gesture. "So, let's have a round of applause for Elena, our queen of spreadsheets." The applause was scattered and awkward. My team looked horrified. Others just clapped along, following the CEO's lead. He had just publicly executed my professional reputation. He painted me as a low-level worker who couldn't keep up, a footnote in his story. As I walked out of that building for the last time, carrying a little box with my stuff, the anger was a white-hot furnace in my chest. The polite exit I'd planned was gone. It was replaced by a cold, hard clarity. He thought he had the last word. He thought he had erased me. He had no idea what he'd just unleashed. He mocked my work, the very details he didn't understand. And it was in those details, in those spreadsheets he laughed at, that his downfall was waiting. That first week of freedom was just a blur of anger and sleepless nights. I'd wake up with Richard's condescending voice in my head. Asterisk, queen of spreadsheets. Asterisk, the public nature of it all was what stung the most. He hadn't just fired me. He'd excommunicated a founding member and branded her incompetent on the way out. He did it to make sure no one else would ever dare question him. I tried to let it go. I updated my resume, talked to recruiters, and tried to focus on what was next. But this burning sense of injustice just wouldn't leave me alone. He was getting away with it. Not just the personal insult, but the fraud the whole company was now built on. The stock was soaring, and every news article praising his visionary leadership felt like a slap in the face. He was a king in a castle of lies, and I was one of the only people who had the blueprints. That's when I remembered the drive. About a month before I quit, when I knew they were ignoring my concerns about the fraud, I had a moment of paranoid foresight. It wasn't about revenge then. It was about self-preservation. I knew they were building a story to discredit me if I pushed the issue. So I did something very careful. I created an encrypted backup of everything. Not just my reports, but the raw evidence. I had server logs showing the exact times the synthetic user scripts ran. I had database snapshots from before and after the fake revenue numbers were recorded. I had copies of the exact lines of code they used to massage the numbers. And the smoking gun, email chains. Emails where I'd raised red flags and been told to stand down. Emails from Richard himself, telling the finance department to be more aggressive with their accounting. It was a complete, undeniable record of the crime. I had downloaded it all to an encrypted solid-state drive, a tiny little piece of plastic I had just tossed in a drawer. One evening, I was scrolling through the news when a headline caught my eye. It was about a different tech company hit with a huge SEC fine for accounting fraud. The article mentioned the whole investigation started with a confidential whistleblower tip. It went on to describe the SEC's whistleblower program and how it pays people with inside knowledge to come forward. A light bulb went off in the darkest corners of my mind. Whistleblower. The word sounded so dramatic, so serious. It wasn't a word I ever thought I'd associate with myself. I was an engineer, a builder. My instinct is to fix things, not tear them down. But I had tried to fix things from the inside. I followed the rules. And in return, I was gaslighted, stonewalled, and publicly humiliated. The system wasn't broken. It was working just how Richard wanted it to. The public humiliation was the final push. Richard hadn't just wronged me. He'd given me the motivation to burn it all down. He had made it personal. My desire for revenge now lined up perfectly with the public interest. Exposing the fraud wasn't just for my own vindication anymore. It was about protecting the investors buying into a lie. It was about holding a powerful, arrogant man accountable. The Queen of Spreadsheets was about to show the king what her spreadsheets could really do. The idea of becoming a whistleblower was terrifying. It felt like stepping off a cliff. My whole career was built on trust and discretion. This was the opposite. This was declaring war. For the next 2 weeks, I put myself through a self-imposed boot camp, diving into the ridiculously complex world of the SEC. I read everything I could about the Dodd-Frank Act, the law that had basically supercharged the SEC's whistleblower program. I learned the mechanics. A whistleblower with original, credible information that leads to a successful case, with over $1 million in sanctions, gets an award of 10% to 30% of the money collected. The numbers were shocking. Since it started, the program had paid out billions. In the last fiscal year alone, 2024, the SEC awarded over $255 million to 47 individuals. The money wasn't my main motivation. My anger was fuel enough, but it was a powerful symbol that the government valued this kind of truth. More importantly, I learned about the protections. The SEC takes confidentiality very seriously. A key rule lets a whistleblower submit a tip anonymously as long as they have a lawyer. This was critical. Richard was powerful and vindictive. If my name got out, he'd destroy my career and blacklist me from the industry. Anonymity was my shield. But I also read the horror stories. I read about the immense personal and professional risks. Even with legal protections, retaliation is a real threat. Lives get turned upside down, and the process can take years, a long, agonizing wait with no guarantee. Was I ready for that? Richard's mocking laugh echoed in my ears. Asterisk, Queen of Spreadsheets. Asterisk, yes. I was ready. My next step was finding a lawyer. I needed specialists who lived and breathed SEC whistleblower cases. After days of research, I found a firm in DC with a great track record. I scheduled a video call, my heart pounding. I was about to trust these strangers with my entire future. I spoke with a senior partner, a woman named Sarah. She was calm, professional, and just listened. I finished my story, my voice hoarse. I told her everything. The fake users, the revenue tricks, the pushback, and finally the public humiliation. Then I told her about the encrypted drive. Sarah's expression changed. A flicker of intense interest lit up her eyes. "You have documented evidence?" she asked, her voice sharp. "Logs, emails, database snapshots." "Everything," I said. "Meticulously organized. Timestamps, IP addresses, email headers. Everything." She leaned forward. "Ms. Valerius," she said, using my last name for the first time, "most people come to us with suspicions, with pieces of a puzzle. You have the whole puzzle, solved, with a step-by-step instruction manual. You have a case, a very, very strong case." The relief was so huge, I almost cried. I wasn't crazy. I wasn't paranoid. The fraud was real, and the evidence was undeniable. For the first time since I'd walked out of that building, I felt powerful. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of intense, secret activity. Working with Sarah and her team felt like joining a spy ring. All our communication was on encrypted channels. They sent me a dedicated, air-gapped laptop that had never touched the internet. The security level was a constant reminder of the stakes. My role shifted. I was now the star witness and technical expert. The lawyers knew the law, but I knew where the bodies were buried. I designed the cemetery. I spent hours walking them through the Odyssey platform's architecture, drawing diagrams, explaining data flows, and pointing out the exact backdoors Richard's team had exploited. They were using my own creations against the company, I explained to Sarah on a late-night call. It was a bitter irony that only made the case stronger. Compiling the official SEC tip, the Form TCR, was painstaking work. It couldn't just be a data dump. It had to be a compelling story that would grab an enforcement attorney's attention. The SEC got almost 25,000 tips in fiscal year 2024, so ours had to stand out. My job was to translate the technical fraud into plain English. I wrote appendices that explained how to replicate the fraud. "Query this database," I wrote, "and you'll find user accounts from a single IP block. Cross-reference their logs, and you will see they perform no unique actions. They are ghosts in the machine." I annotated the emails, adding context. Richard's email telling the CFO to be more aggressive was placed right next to a chart showing a suspicious revenue spike. My own emails warning them were included as proof that I had tried to report this internally. Sarah said this was critical. The recently reintroduced SEC Whistleblower Reform Act of 2025 was aimed at strengthening protections for internal whistleblowers like me, and showing I tried to do the right thing first put me on the firmest possible ground. As we built the package, a grim satisfaction grew inside me. Every piece of data, every line of code, every condescending email from Richard was another nail in his coffin. The spreadsheets he mocked were now the foundation of a 100-page, ironclad legal case. Finally, the day came. Sarah called. "It's ready, Elena. It's one of the strongest submissions I've ever seen. We're filing it this afternoon. Once I hit send, it's out of our hands. Are you sure?" I looked around my small apartment, a world away from the gleaming campus of Sterling Innovations. I thought about the years I'd poured into that company. I thought about the stolen ideas and the passed-over promotion. And I thought about his laugh. "I'm ready," I said. "Burn it to the ground." There was a pause. Then Sarah said, "The submission is away." I hung up. A strange calm washed over me. The sword had been thrown. Now, all I could do was wait for it to land. The months after filing the tip were the hardest. It was a period of absolute, deafening silence. I got a new job as a senior data architect at a stable healthcare tech company. It was good work, but my mind was always elsewhere. Every single day, I'd check the financial news, searching for any mention of Sterling Innovations. Nothing. The stock kept climbing. Richard was on the cover of another business magazine, hailed as a tech titan. It felt like I had thrown a stone into the ocean and it had just vanished. Doubt started to creep in. Maybe I'd overestimated the evidence. Maybe my lawyers were wrong. The SEC is a massive bureaucracy. Maybe my tip was just buried in a mountain of 25,000 others from the last year. I started to feel foolish. I had occasional, brief check-ins with Sarah. "This is normal, Elena," she'd say. "These investigations take a long time. Silence is often a good sign. It means they're working." But it was small comfort. Richard was out there winning, and I was just waiting. Then, about 9 months after the submission, the first tremor hit. It was a tiny article buried on a financial news site. Sterling Innovations postpones Q3 earnings call. The official reason was something bland about needing additional time to complete the quarterly review. My heart started pounding. I knew what that meant. It meant auditors were asking questions the company couldn't answer. A few weeks later, the second tremor. An investigative journalist published a piece on his blog. Questions mount around Sterling Innovations' growth metrics. He cited anonymous sources inside the company worried about accounting problems. The SEC was clearly interviewing people. The stock dipped 5%. Richard went on TV, looking tanned and completely unbothered. He dismissed the article as the work of short sellers and disgruntled former employees. He called the claims baseless. Watching him lie so smoothly on national television made my blood boil. But this time it was mixed with anticipation. He was cornered. The tremors got stronger. The Wall Street Journal ran a front-page story. SEC opens formal investigation into Sterling Innovations. The stock plunged 20% in pre-market trading. The story said the investigation was focused on revenue recognition and user count reporting. The exact two things from my tip. It was happening. The stone I threw hadn't disappeared. It had started a tsunami, and it was now heading for shore. The day the dam finally broke was a Tuesday. I was at my new job, trying to focus, but a news alert on my phone kept buzzing. Then, at 11:15 a.m., it started vibrating uncontrollably. A flood of alerts, one after another. SEC charges Sterling Innovations and CEO Richard Sterling with massive accounting fraud. Sterling Innovations accused of inflating revenue, faking user data for years. CEO Richard Sterling faces civil penalties, potential criminal referral. My hands were shaking as I clicked the link. The SEC's press release was brutal and precise. It was my tip, transformed into an official government indictment. It laid out the entire scheme, the synthetic users, the improper revenue recognition. It even quoted internal emails, the evidence I had provided. I opened my brokerage app and pulled up the stock symbol for Sterling Innovations. The chart was a vertical red line. Trading was halted. When it resumed 15 minutes later, the floor fell out. It plunged 50%, then 70%, then 85%. Billions of dollars in market value gone in an hour. The empire Richard built on lies had evaporated in the harsh light of truth. The media went into a frenzy. Richard Sterling's face was everywhere, but he wasn't smug anymore. He was grim-faced, surrounded by lawyers, refusing to answer questions. The visionary was now a fraud. That afternoon, the board announced an emergency meeting. By evening, another press release. Richard Sterling was removed as CEO and chairman, effective immediately. He was fired from the company that bore his name. I sat on my couch, watching the chaos on the news. It was an out-of-body experience. I did this. My anger and humiliation, my meticulous documentation, it all led to this. I saw shell-shocked employees leaving the campus, their faces a mix of fear and confusion. I felt a pang of sadness for them, the innocent people caught in the middle. But that was overwhelmed by a profound sense of justice. Richard created this rot. I only supplied the antidote. The king was dethroned. The queen of spreadsheets had won. A little over a year passed. The world moved on. Sterling Innovations, after bankruptcy and a fire sale of its assets, was gone. Its name became a cautionary tale in business schools. Richard Sterling, after a long legal battle, was barred from ever serving as an officer of a public company again. He paid tens of millions in fines, a fraction of his fortune, but enough to brand him a failure. I kept working at my job, finding quiet satisfaction in building ethical data systems. I never said a word about my role. My anonymity held. To the world, the collapse was the work of an anonymous hero. Then, one Thursday afternoon, I got the call from Sarah. Her voice was lighter than I'd ever heard it. "Elena," she said, "the final orders are in." The SEC collected the full amount from the company and from Richard. It's over. I felt a final, deep exhale I didn't even know I was holding. It's really over. "That's not all," she continued, a smile in her voice. "The commission held its final determination meeting on your award claim. They voted to grant you the maximum percentage." She paused. "They are awarding you 30% of the total sanctions collected. The check will be wired to the account we set up within 10 business days." She told me the number. It was an amount of money so vast it felt unreal. Life-altering generational wealth. It was more than Richard had left after all his fines. For a second, I was speechless. It was never about the money. But the sheer scale of it was a stunning, undeniable validation. It was the system working. My old life, the one where I had to work for men, like Richard Sterling, was over. I resigned from my job a few months later and took some time to travel, to decompress. When I came back, I used a portion of the money to start my own consulting firm, a data analytics firm founded on one principle: radical transparency. We help companies build ethical data systems. I am a CEO now. My company is successful and respected. I'm more successful on my own terms than Richard Sterling ever was. The ultimate revenge isn't just watching your enemy fall. It's building your own empire on the ashes of theirs, but building it better, stronger, and with an integrity they could never understand. He tried to mock my work, to reduce my life's passion to a punchline. But in the end, that work was the one thing he couldn't lie his way out of. The numbers didn't lie. And now I'm the one with the last laugh. So that's my story. It started with public humiliation and ended with quiet, decisive accountability. But I have to ask you, was this a cold act of revenge or a necessary act of justice? Did Richard Sterling and his company get what they deserved, or did the fallout go too far? I've wrestled with that question myself, and I'd be fascinated to know what you think. Let me know in the comments below. It's funny, really. Richard tried to define me by my work, to belittle me with it. He never understood that my work was my power. The spreadsheets he laughed at became the evidence that unraveled his entire world. It's a powerful reminder that truth has a weight and a value that you can't always see on a stock ticker, but sooner or later, it always comes due. Thank you for watching.